I would like to introduce Ellen Efros, who will introduce our presenter and our session for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Center for European Studies, they have sort of owned this piece of real estate on our ILR calendar on Mondays in the fall at 1:30 for years. If they haven't owned it, they certainly have adverse possession of it. And we are more than glad to turn this time slot over to them because their programs are always engaging, interesting, thorough, and really well done. For those of you who are unfamiliar with CES, the Center for European Studies, this is part of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UF. And excuse me, it's a multidisciplinary area and language study center. It really crosses, it's really an interdisciplinary center because it includes disciplines in history, sociology, political science, film studies, law, education, business, musicology, and many, many more of the discrete disciplines at UF. Its goal is to promote the learning of European, less commonly taught languages through language programs in Czech, Hungarian, modern Greek, Polish, and Turkish. And it also supports other European language programs in addition to the interdisciplinary studies and the training of scholars and experts in European studies. Now, Zach Selden, who is our presenter today, he and his wife, Amy Krapel, who was supposed to speak last week, but she had laryngitis, so she's going to speak at the end of the program. They're sort of the face, at least for me, of CES. Zach focuses on U.S. national security and alliances with emphasis on transatlantic relationships. He's written a number of books and he's examined different forms of alliance relations that the U.S. maintains and how these alliances can be leveraged to ensure American security interests. There is no doubt that he is a scholar and a very renowned both teacher and mentor to a lot of the scholars at UF and in other places of the country. So we're very lucky to have Zach today. He has an incredibly busy schedule, and I'm glad he made time for us. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Zach.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Let me just share my screen here so you can see what I'm going to talk to today. I like to say, I really enjoy doing these presentations at OCAMIC because you folks have a certain level of perspective that often is lacking in my students. I often joke with them that I have shirts that are older than them, but it's actually not a joke. I think this shirt may actually go back to about 2001. So it's nice having a chance to talk to people who actually have a little bit of historical perspective, remember more than just one or two presidential administrations, and have some context to put things in. And so what I want to talk to today, some of the things I'm going to say here or throw out here may be provocative and may annoy you, and that's good. That'll mean we'll have a good discussion. But I kind of want to look at this transition that we've gone through from President Trump to President Biden. And the reason to do that is to try to sort of tease out what things are similar and stable in this transatlantic relationship and what things change and why. And that to me is kind of an interesting question. And let me just sort of go off a little bit off into sort of a more academic bend for a second here to explain why. Oops, there we go. So in sort of the world of people who study foreign policy, there are different camps, and we all argue about things. But one big issue that we talk about a lot. So what really drives foreign policy? What's really kind of in the driver's seat of across administrations? And you've got one school of people who would say, look, it's about the international system. So you've got a group of people who out there would say, look, it's all about balance of power. That regardless of who's in charge, they're attuned to, opportunities to take advantage of shifts in power, or periods of weakness are going to lead to certain decisions, and periods of relative strength. And, really who's in charge, their decisions are pretty heavily constrained. That's one school of thought. And then you've got people who say, look, sure, the international balance of power is a factor, but you really want to understand what goes on in foreign policy, in American foreign policy, you need to understand domestic politics, right? That foreign policy is very much an outgrowth of domestic politics. And so you need to understand regional politics, for example, as represented in Congress. And you need to understand how interest groups have effective power in shaping foreign policy, whether they're ethnic interest groups or industry groups. And then you've got to think about economic interests, right? And the large bodies that drive that and their interests and how that's going to impact on foreign policy, particularly in trade issues and things like that. All right, so that's another school of thought. And then you got a lot of people who say, no, all those things may matter, but at the end of the day, somebody makes a decision, right? People make decisions, or groups of people make decisions, but it's a call. Do we impose sanctions or not, right? Do we engage in this treaty negotiation or not? Do we establish a deterrent relationship with a state or not? And so somebody's making those choices, and the people at the top, particularly presidents, really matter, right? And they have different personalities. Some are more risk acceptant, some are more risk adverse, some have military backgrounds, some do not. They may often have very different, what you might call, worldviews about, what they think leads to what in the world and in international relations. And that's really what's going to shape foreign policy. All right, so if you have those sort of divergent kind of ideas about what's really, the major factor, and obviously these things all interact to some degree, right? So it's really a question of what you think dominates when and why. Then this sort of transition between two very different presidents kind of presents an opportunity, sort of a natural test bed to consider some of these things, because, regardless of what you want to say or think about a President Trump or a President Biden, I think we can agree that they are extremely different individuals, right? And their approaches, their personalities, their experiences, the kinds of people they bring in with them. So if this sort of level of analysis is kind of more individual level really matters, then we would expect to see lots of change, right? Widespread change. And you do see some, but do you see as much as you might think? And so my question is to sort of look at the transatlantic relationship. And that's what there we are. And sort of consider this question. And why focus on the US-European relationship? Well, for one thing, it's a massive relationship. It's massively complex. There probably really isn't anything like it that the United States has with any other region of the world. So for example, we often talk about US-China trade. The US-European trade, US-EU trade alone is huge. We're talking in the order of something like $2 billion a day on average, right? And that includes not just goods, but also services. And of course, our economies are more linked than simply trade. We own more of each other's companies, private companies, than we enjoy that sort of interchange with any other part of the world. We also own more of each other's debt, right? Sovereign debt, right? Europeans own tremendous amounts of US treasuries, and we own an awful lot of the sovereign debt of European countries. So we are very closely economically tied in many ways, in a very intense and deep way. On top of that, the US-European relationship incorporates the longest, and I would argue the most intense and integrated security alliance that the United States has ever enjoyed with any state or group of states. If you look at the integration through NATO over decades of interoperability and working together and training together, it's really quite unique, right? And the vast majority of the EU member states are also NATO members. So we are very much tied at the hip in a lot of ways on security issues. There's another area that I want to speak to today that is one that most people don't focus on as much, but I think is quite important, and that's what I would term energy security. And this sort of gets to the issue that Europe is heavily reliant on imported energy, right? An enormous amount of that energy, particularly in the form of natural gas, comes from Russia. Right? And this in the past has really opened up vulnerabilities in Europe and a lot of ongoing concerns about the security of energy supply in Europe. Well, something that has changed a lot in the last, especially the last 5 years, really, is the American component of this and the export of American LNG. Not a huge amount of it actually goes to Europe, but as I will explain later, it's playing a role where it's sort of acting as an underwriter of European energy security and ensuring that while Russia is still a major supplier of energy, it cannot use that really to exploit that weakness, that potential weakness for political gain. So it's an important component of the relationship that I think is recognized on both sides, and once again ties the transatlantic relationship together in a very multifaceted, interwoven way. So it's a good place to focus, right? Because you've got so many different things to consider. And it is, as I said, one of the most deep and intense sets of relationships the United States enjoys with any other grouping of countries. So what's the bottom line of this presentation I'm going to make? Well, I think as you start to work through these sort of three sets of issues, the trade issues, the security issues, the energy issues, there's actually a lot of consistency across two administrations run by two very different people. And so that experience of more consistency than change, and I'm not saying there isn't any, but there is more consistency, tells us something. And it may tell us that many of the drivers of foreign policy are less in the personalities and the individuals at the top, and much more rooted, as one might think, in the sort of enduring national interests that really kind of transcend individuals in occupying the top positions. So what I thought I would do is sort of walk through each of those issues and kind of explain how that works out, and then we can have more of a discussion about that. First thing I think we could start with is the trade issues. And, this is, trade issues are dull, right? I mean, even in the world of international relations, the people who do, international political economy are seen as sort of like, yeah, you guys are boring, right? And in fact, US-European trade issues are intentionally dull, right? Both sides generally work quite hard to make sure that things are quite smooth because everyone recognizes how important the stakes can be. That being said, right, the Trump administration changed some things in this that really raised some, I would say, some red flags in the trade relationship between the United States and the EU. And the question is really, so what happened with that? So once again, say what you will about President Donald Trump, but he's not one for doing dull things, right? So even under him, trade is not going to be a dull issue. And he quite intentionally ramped up tensions on a couple of issues with Europe, with the EU. And there were two in particular that really became one major one and one sort of more ancillary one. But the really major one was US tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum produced in the European Union. And there were a number of reasons for this. The US was accusing European suppliers of a number of unfair trading practices, but in the end, in 2018, the Trump administration imposed significant tariffs, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, based on what's called Section 232 of the Trade Act, which allows the president or the administration, I should say, to impose tariffs for national security reasons. And the logic here being that the production of steel and aluminum is critical for a whole range of military hardware, and that the steady decrease of American production of those items was a national security vulnerability. That was the argument. It's not the only time that Section 232 has been used. It's just probably the first time in about 30 years that any president has thought to bring it out. Anyway, so this became a big issue in US-EU trade relations, and a number of retaliatory tariffs were imposed, and this became a big fracas. Right? So this is definitely one change that was put into place by the Trump administration that we can then focus on and see, well, okay, what happens with that? A second one, somewhat less significant, is an ongoing issue with tariffs on aircrafts. And this actually gets to an older, longer standing complaint by the United States. This is a complaint in the World Trade Organization that says, hey, the EU and the national governments are unfairly subsidizing the production of aircraft, Airbus aircraft. And this aircraft here is an Airbus 320 and American Airlines livery. And this is unfair, and this has to be dealt with. And so the WTO is still going through that process. But in 2020, the Trump administration decided to impose tariffs on European aircraft, and based on these unfair practices, while the WTO process is still unfolding. So that's where things stood, right? Under the Trump administration, these are the two, I would argue, the two big issues that really inflame trade tensions in what would otherwise normally be a very dull area of US-European relations. So what happens with the Biden administration? What changes? Oops, skip something. All right, must have dropped a slide out. All right, so what changes with Biden? Well, here's the interesting thing, not that much, right? Not that much at all, particularly on the first issue, the steel and aluminum tariffs. Those tariffs are still in place. And in fact, the argument by the current administration here, and I'm picking up a quote here from the Secretary of Commerce, is that, quote, they help to save American jobs, and they are a critical component or critical plank in the Biden economic plan. That doesn't sound like something that's going to change anytime soon. More recently, in the last couple of months, there was a G7 meeting, and both the European side and the EU side agreed that they are, quote unquote, committed to ending the tariffs and want to do so by the end of the year. But it hasn't happened yet, right? I mean, the can has essentially been kicked down the road. But the bottom line is that, the new administration could have dropped those tariffs, which were a distinct irritant in the US-EU relationship. They chose not to, right? They came up with a somewhat different justification for why they're there, but they didn't go away. And we have a similar kind of situation with the aircraft tariff issue, where, that has been also sort of kicked down the road by the same G7 meeting. There's been a suspension by both sides of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. sort of pending further investigation, further discussion. So there's been something of a ceasefire, but nobody's willing to step back from this one and say, no, we're permanently settling it. So perhaps a reduction in tensions on that one, not so much on the first one. So when you sort of look at the US-EU trade relationship, and you think about the things that were changed under the Trump administration, which were particular irritants in that relationship, they're a little different now, but they're still very much on the table. And so perhaps the rhetoric has shifted somewhat, but the policy substance is not terribly different. So that's one issue I think to point to. Let's take another one. It's a little more complex and one that actually a lot of times is overlooked, as I said, in the US-European relationship. And I think that's kind of a mistake. I'll bring up a couple of charts. I don't know how well they're going to reproduce on these slides for you, but just to sort of give you some impression. As I mentioned before, that the European Union imports most of its energy, right? And a lot of that in the form of natural gas. And Russia is the big supplier. So Russia supplies about 40% of all of Europe's natural gas. It's a huge chunk. The other big chunks come from Norway and Algeria. And the United States is actually a relatively small supplier of natural gas into Europe. It's, it varies 10 to 15% in that range. But here's the thing, the United States has experienced an enormous boom in natural gas production over the last 10 years or so, in particular since about 2017. And now the US is one of the world's largest suppliers and exporters. And just, I'm not sure how well this will show up for you, but it gives you some idea of just looking at the shape of this curve. This here is 2017, and you just see this, it just starts, the line goes zooming up like this. We've had a few Phillips here, obviously, with the recessions and, associated with COVID-19, but the pattern hasn't changed much. The United States is still a massive exporter and producer of natural gas. As I said, most of that gas isn't going to Europe, right? And the reason it's not going to Europe is because it can get a better price going to Asia and Latin America. So it's being liquefied as natural gas. It's going in huge tankers off to ports in Latin America and especially in Asia. And right now, the natural gas market's going a little bit insane and prices are going crazy. But what you do see is that whenever prices increase significantly in Europe, American natural gas becomes much more competitive there, and the amount of American natural gas going to Europe spikes, sometimes twice, 3 times, what it was a few weeks earlier, simply based on the price fluctuations, and cargoes get directed to that direction. And also, what you have now is a situation where Russia really can't exploit its dominant supplier position for political reasons. It did so in 2006, it did so again in 2009, and it terrified a lot of people in Europe about what energy dependence on Russia meant. But today, right, you essentially have the United States acting as this underwriter or this sort of guarantor of European gas supply. If the Russian government decided to cut back, right, for political reasons, or raise its prices, that's simply going to get filled in by other suppliers. And the United States is a very well-produced, external supplier. Part of that has to do with the fact that because of the potential vulnerability that this presents vis-a-vis Russia, a number of countries in Europe have built much larger liquefied natural gas terminals. But it has to do with simply the fact that the United States is able to introduce an enormous amount of gas into the global marketplace. And this just changes the dynamics. It means that Russia can't play these games. If it raises prices, gas is going to flow in from other places because it will be highly competitive. And that's not going to get it what it wants. If it tries to cut supply, it's just going to lose market share. So Russia is now forced into this position of being essentially a normal provider, a normal supplier, right? As opposed to this dominant supplier role that it had, which it thought it could use for political purposes and did in sort of the mid 2000s. That's done with now. And that's done with now primarily because of the American boom in natural gas production. It's just one slide. And this one's just another one, just showing you the green bits here are exports coming out of the United States, 2020, 2021, and what's projected for 2022. Now, which it's just a steady rise, right, in terms of the massive amount of exporting going on. So that's not changing. So let's ask ourselves, what changed from the Trump administration to the Biden administration on natural gas, and particularly as might impact upon Europe? Well, one thing that got certainly a lot of attention was the executive order back in January that some people, I put it in quotation marks here, was about banning fracking. Hydraulic fracking is a way of releasing natural gas. I'd argue not so fast on that one, right? When you actually look at the details of that order, it only applies to new leases on federal land. Well, if you go back to this chart here, right, and you actually ask yourself, oops, sorry, this chart here, which of these bars are on federal land, what you find is that the vast majority of these are actually on private land, right? And so what you do on federal land doesn't have a huge impact in that sense. It's also the case that US production has remained at very similar levels, right? During 2021 as it did during 2020 or 2019. And if nothing else, as I showed before, exports are projected to grow. That's not going to change. So yes, that executive order got a lot of attention. The actual impact of it is arguably pretty minimal. The other thing that changed with the Biden administration, and this relates more directly to the US-European relationship, is ending American sanctions on a particular pipeline that goes directly from Russia to Germany called Nord Stream 2. All right, well, why is this so controversial? Well, in the Trump administration, the United States put sanctions on this pipeline, and in particular sanctioned the company, a Swiss company, which was actually constructing it, and said basically, you know, bad things will happen to you if you continue working on this project. And they stopped, right? And so the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was interrupted really in its last few miles. Now, why was this pipeline controversial? It goes directly from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. It cuts out the Eastern European countries that other pipelines go through. And by cutting them out, it cuts them out of essentially they get transport fees, right? So it knocks them out of this, seen as a way of undercutting them and also cementing a more direct European or German-Russian relationship. And this pipeline in particular is a big one, right? This is going to double the amount of natural gas coming from Russia directly to Germany. So it's a big deal in that sense. And the argument was during the Trump administration in particular was to say, look, you know, Germany's becoming too dependent on Russia. Russia's going to be able to essentially, you know, use Germany. We don't want to see that happen. So we're going to try to block this pipeline. And like I said, the Biden administration essentially relaxed sanctions, eased sanctions on this. That pipeline's going to be constructed now. It's going to be finished. But does that change anything? You know, now once again, we're back to this question of, you know, the sort of the rhetoric of these things and the reality. Well, the reality is, yes, Russia can now import more natural gas directly into Germany, but the same market forces are at work. If Russia tries to play games with that gas, if it tries to jack up prices in the middle of winter, if it tries to cut back supply in order to gain some kind of concession, what's going to happen? There's going to be a flood of natural gas filling in for that, coming from the outside, you know, a lot of that would be coming from the United States as well as some other suppliers, which have the ability to do it. The only reason they're not selling their gas there now in those quantities is because they can get a better price elsewhere. But if Russia does things that drive up the price, that gas is going to flow there. So, and we've seen that happen in the past. So essentially, Russia is trapped in this position of being a normal player, right? And the United States is doing that because it's acting essentially as this sort of underwriter of European energy security. So in the end, not much has changed, right? The fundamental relationship remains the same. And the United States plays this role as underwriter, once again, because it's in our national interest to do so. So that's another area to consider. Let's consider another area, probably, the area that I know best and work in most, which is sort of thinking about the general security relationship. And we can think about this in terms of the NATO relationship. That's really kind of the core of this, but also sort of the broader US-EU security relationship. So what's been going on? Well, once again, regardless of what you think of President Trump, I think you can agree that, he was oftentimes gratuitously insulting to allies in Europe, and took a very transactional view towards the security relationship, in the sense of, what are you paying into this versus what are we paying into it, and what do we get out of this? And so there's a big emphasis on, meeting spending commitments, essentially input measures of defense. And the number was, 2% of GDP spent on defense. It's not a very good measure. It doesn't really tell you much about what people are actually doing, but it's one that they heavily focused on. And like I said, it had this sort of kind of pay to play language, right? If you guys are paying in, then, your fair share, then we're willing to commit, but if you're not, we're not going to. And this caused a lot of concern across Europe about what the United States was doing, what kind of partner it was going to be, what the durability of the alliance was. One of the things I found kind of intriguing about this period is, while the rhetoric was all in that vein and quite disturbing at times, the administration itself actually kind of went out of its way to really increase the US military commitment to Europe, particularly in the most vulnerable regions, Eastern Europe. So the Trump administration built on an Obama administration effort to bolster the US military position in the sort of exposed Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. It also did a number of things to really sort of send messages to Russia that we were heavily committed to the defense of those countries. Interestingly enough, they ran a bunch of military exercises using essentially special forces there, and training, Latvians and Estonians and Lithuanians to act as essentially guerrilla warriors. So that, yes, if there was an actual invasion, Russian invasion of these countries, that they could make it extremely messy to try and occupy that region. The United States launched really a massive exercise to demonstrate how quickly it could move heavy military equipment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, towed artillery from both Western Europe and from the United States all the way across and into Eastern Europe, And these messages are not lost on Russia, right? That they're the target of this, and I think they picked up what was going on. On top of that, the Trump administration really shifted the relationship in some ways with Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, being involved in a on again, off again hot war with Russia over parts of its eastern territory. And while previous administrations were willing to supply Ukraine with different kinds of aid, the Trump administration stepped that up to lethal military aid, designed to really be able to take out Russian tanks if necessary. It also did something very interesting in that it opened a what they call a military support facility in the on the Black Sea, very close to the Crimean region, which is the area that's that Russia has taken over from Ukraine. And that maritime support facility, it's not a formal base, but it's a place where clearly American vessels operating in the Black Sea can stop, be reloaded, whatever else. It closely ties Ukraine and the United States, and really does sort of put a bit of a permanent American presence in Ukraine. Once again, another very strong message to Russia. So that's all of what happened. You know, the rhetoric was one thing, the actions I think were a little bit different. And so that leads to the question, what changed? What's different with the Biden administration? I'd argue some things have changed. One, there's been less support for Ukraine. You know, I'd say there's broad similarities in terms of supporting Ukraine and trying to help Ukraine stand up on its own 2 feet vis-a-vis Russia. But there hasn't been the same emphasis on lethal military aid or things like that. But, you know, that maritime support facility in the Crimea region is still there. That's not going anywhere. Other things, you know, it's difficult to sort of judge things like military exercises and whatnot in the current environment, because obviously a lot of that has been trimmed back given the whole COVID-19 problem. But by and large, one can argue that there's been, you know, a fairly similar approach to European security and deterring Russian actions and influence operations across Europe. Have there been some other changes that have been for the negative? Well, yes, arguably. The pullout from Afghanistan was done, frankly, without coordination with a lot of European allies, which had put a lot of credibility and a lot of people into the Afghanistan mission in support of US goals. I mean, don't forget that was, you know, not just an American mission, it became a NATO mission. And the fact that the United States was less than forthcoming about its plans and really did not consult in advance with many of its allies was galling, frankly, in both NATO and EU circles. There's also, some of you may have heard about the Australia, UK, US partnership arrangement, particularly arranging around submarines, sometimes called the AUKUS deal. And this once again became a very big issue in US-European affairs, particularly US-French affairs. Why? Because the French had a contract to sell $60 billion worth of submarines to Australia. Now, things had changed over the years, and the Australians were now thinking what they really preferred was to have nuclear-propelled submarines, which would give them a much broader range in the region. And so, you know, there were valid strategic reasons for making this shift, but nonetheless, France was kept out of the loop, right? And it was galling to France to have this happen. It's been the first time that I can recall that France has recalled an ambassador from the United States in a very, very long time. It's been significantly damaging to French-American relations over the past few months, and we'll see how we get back from that. You know, I think the larger underlying problem has been there's a message here that's been sent by the United States to many of its European allies, which is frankly a lack of trust. That, you know, we're not sharing information in a timely fashion. We're not consulting because we're not sure if we do on some of these sensitive things that those matters will stay in the room. I think that's the underlying tone here, and that's definitely been sort of a weakening point in US-European and US-EU relations. But on the flip side, there's been a lot more cooperation on the Iran nuclear deal, and that is a big diplomatic issue for the EU. It's one where they've put a lot of, or staked a lot of status as an organization operating in a diplomatic context. And so the United States coming back into that has been an important point, I think, for US-EU relations. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in this case. many things have remained the same in the broad outlines. There have been some changes. Many of those changes have not necessarily led to a better relationship. But I think it's always worth asking ourselves, something of a hypothetical. Yes, there are some differences, but it's absolutely entirely possible, if not likely, that a second term President Trump would have done pretty much the same things in the US European relationship. President Trump talked about getting out of Afghanistan on a pretty firm deadline as well. There's no reason to think that that administration would have been any more consultative with its allies, given its past behavior. And the Australia, UK, US sub deal, once again, there's no indication necessarily that President Trump or Trump administration would have been more forthcoming with France about that as it was ongoing. In fact, interestingly enough, the defense minister of France, when he was blindsided with this and complaining about this very vocally, said, this sort of thing is what we would have expected from a President Trump, not a President Biden, right? So, maybe in some ways, these things that I'm pointing to are distinctions and differences, could also be similarities as well. So what do I want to sort of conclude with here? I think the important thing is that if you take a complex relationship, and really, as I was trying to point out, there aren't too many relationships the United States enjoys with other foreign entities that are as complex and as deep as the US-EU relationship. And if you sort of break that down, you find that there's a lot of consistency. Yes, rhetoric changes. Yes, there are certain distinctions and variations in policy, but the broad shape of things stays the same. Why? Because the broad national interest doesn't change much. And so that's really the key to understanding what is done and why in foreign policy, more so than focusing, I think, on the individual foibles or personal histories of individual leaders. So I think that's where I will wrap up, if that's okay with you. And, like I said, I've thrown out some things here that are potentially controversial, so we can argue about those or talk about anything else you want. I'm yours for the next at least 20 minutes or so till I got to run off to my next class.
Okay, well, I'll start. Zach, my question for you is, how does what has happened in Britain with Brexit affect the relationship between the United States and the EU? It's both in terms of security and commerce, because there has to be some type of, I would say, triangular, relationship between now Britain, which sort of stands alone, the EU, which is a conglomerate of countries, in the United States.
I mean, you're raising a really interesting set of points, some of which, we will wait and see to find out what's going on. But some things that are happening now, which I think are kind of a direct outgrowth of that. So, for example, the AUKUS deal, the Australia, UK, US deal, this is actually a much broader strategic partnership when you read it through, right? It's not just about the submarine deal. That's sort of the first part of it, but then it gets into a lot of other stuff. And I think that's a distinct outgrowth of Great Britain's attempt to craft a new foreign policy that's very distinct from being tied to the European Union, and one that is tied to much more of what you might call an Anglosphere, right? So in this case, sort of injecting Britain and Britain's contribution, particularly in nuclear technology and submarine technology, into a US-Australia relationship, and possibly extending Britain's presence in that part of the world. It's by no means a coincidence that the British government sailed a flotilla of Royal Naval vessels through the South China Sea to emphasize freedom of navigation just a week after that was signed, right? I mean, that's very much part of Britain claiming, a different foreign policy orientation, one closely tied to the United States, to Australia, possibly Canada as well. and one that is very distinct from the European Union. So I think that's ongoing. At the same time, the EU is well aware that as an independent actor in international relations and particularly in security affairs, it will need the assistance of Great Britain to some extent. Great Britain is still one of the major providers of power and power projection. And in fact, France and Britain over the years have developed kind of a mutual dependence on one another in terms of aircraft carriers and aircraft and things like that. So I think Britain will be playing kind of an interesting role in the ongoing years, both doing something quite independent and more perhaps closely tied to the United States in some ways, but also being an important player still in European security affairs, just as kind of an outside player, but still within that.
Okay, we do have some questions. Barbara, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you'd care to comment on the fact that when during the time that President Trump was the president, we know in hindsight now, especially from various papers that have become public, that he owes a tremendous amount of money to Deutsche Bank. And we also know that Deutsche Bank has very close connections with Russia. And I was wondering, what kind of effect would that have on the European Union? The fact that you have this large amount of money bouncing around and being controlled by almost a hostile presence,
Right.
and whether this would have effect not only on the economics, but also the politics of the European Union vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah, you touched on a really interesting issue. And, this actually goes back to Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, back in the early 2000s. And when he left his chancellorship, really the peak of political power in Germany, he took a seat on the board of the major Russian gas exporting company, which was a very provocative choice for someone in his position. But I think it indicates sort of a deeper sense in German politics. Across Europe, you will find very different attitudes towards the relationship with Russia, right? You'll find countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, who are highly skeptical of any kind of relationship with Russia that is not based on, frankly, on deterrence. And then you have countries like Germany, which take a very different view. And this kind of goes back to, the 1970s, and Germany had practiced this sort of view of Ostpolitik, like it could have its own separate, distinct policy towards Russia, even during the Cold War, based primarily on economic interchange and the idea that greater economic interchange would lead to, greater understanding and interdependence. That is still a pretty prevalent view across a large chunk of the German political spectrum. And when you talk to German political figures about the relationship with Russia, you often hear it talked about in purely economic and commercial terms, and the issues that you're bringing up of vulnerabilities, leverage for political pressure, are very much discounted. So yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up, because when you work in European affairs, as I did for a number of years, as a diplomat, you sometimes will find yourself going between different capitals and talking to people about these same issues, but getting very, very different ideas about what these relationships mean. And so, yeah, I think Germany's kind of a really interesting case in this one. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I kind of talked around it. So.
All right, thank you. John, go ahead.
Yeah, the last alliance between Germany and Russia wasn't very favorable to the rest of Europe.
No.
I was questioning about how the European Union is not all that united with some authoritarian governments emerging in Poland and Hungary. I'm just wondering how that should or at all affect our relationship with the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And you're kind of getting a little bit beyond, what my area of personal expertise. But I mean, I think you raise a broader, very important question, which is the European Union still on foreign policy issues is very much an amalgamation of very different states with very different national interests. And it's very difficult for them to all agree on many of these things. I mean, for example, policies towards the North African Middle East region, those are very highly contentious across most of the European Union countries because they have radically different ideas about what should be done. And they're exposed to different problems, right? Italy and Spain and Greece have very different concerns about migration than, Denmark.
But don't they all agree on democratic principles? I mean, I thought
Yes.
that was a major factor in the Union.
Absolutely. And so this becomes, an issue if you believe that these countries are engaging in a form of democratic backsliding. And one of the things that's been very difficult to do is, you can't throw somebody out of the European Union. There's no way to do that. We had the same question, honestly, in NATO, right? I mean, you can't throw people out of NATO. And in fact, there have been times when NATO has incorporated non-democratic states. I mean, during the Cold War, Portugal was a member of NATO. Portugal was distinctly non-democratic until 1975. So, what do you do? And the question of what do you do has been highly controversial because do you want to push these countries to the point that they say, well, we're leaving? Because in Poland, I mean, that's become, kind of a rallying cry for a portion of the political spectrum there. Do you want to do that in Hungary as well? Will that send a country like Hungary more into a Russian orbit? Is that healthy for us? So you're flagging a bunch of different questions that don't really have good answers, because if they did, something would have been done about them by now. But when the European Union was created and NS states were brought in, there really, I don't think, was a concern about quote unquote democratic backsliding. And then you got to ask yourself, what does that mean? What are the thresholds? What are the lines? I mean, what you find about places like, Orban's Hungary is, it's not so much that, there's goon squads running through town, beating up opposition and throwing them into jail. It's nothing so overt as that. It's sort of a matter of, well, opposition newspapers suddenly find that they're having a hard time, getting their subscribers or their advertisers just aren't able to somehow come up with the money at this point in time, or there's a lot of things in terms of access to media and that are done in very subtle ways, and there's always an explanation, right? So it's not so blatant all the time that you can point to and go, aha, you're not democratic anymore, right?
But there are some human rights issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
But once again, those can always be, the what about school is a very effective way of turning that around, because you can always focus on someone's human rights issues in one country, and what you oftentimes find in those countries is their leaders turn around and find, a half dozen cases in your country and say, well, what about them, right? And then suddenly you're in this defensive. China does this all the time, right? So, the fact that these things are in orders of magnitude difference, or that there are subtleties which are lost, doesn't matter in the court of public opinion. So, I mean, I think you're raising really interesting issues. They're unfortunately ones which I have, and I don't think many people have good answers for. So.
Thank you.
Annalise, if you'd like to unmute. We can't hear you. You need to unmute, please, Annalise.
There you go.
Am I on? I don't
I heard it.
Yep.
Okay, the Western European EU members feel that the new members from the former Warsaw Pact countries, want to get the benefits like free borders, stable currency, that everybody has the EU, the euro, and all the benefits, but they don't want to pay their dues somehow. That is the impression of the Western European EU members compared to the Eastern. And many of them feel that they were let in too soon.
Yeah, you go back to a very old issue in European Union enlargement, right? This question of, do you want to bring in lots of states or do you want to be much more selective? This was a big debate between, for example, Britain and France. The French government wanted to, then we're going back to the 1980s, really, be much more selective in the 90s about who you brought in. And the idea that that would preserve the sort of cohesiveness of the European Union. Britain was very much of the perspective that, it's better to bring everybody in that you can. The benefits of economic liberalization would lead to a lot of political transformation and bolster these countries. I think ultimately we've gone for a much larger expansion, right? I mean, that's been the practice. Honestly, it was true with NATO too. I mean, the same debate happened. What's that?
Too fast.
Well, there were a lot of political considerations to be made. One, you want to let countries in when they are ready. Who makes that decision of when you are ready is a very subjective one. You don't want to keep pushing the issue down the road for too long, because then people get frustrated and feel like they'll never see a resolution. So yeah, there's a lot of, this is ultimately a very political process. There's a lot of moving pieces, and you've got to keep a lot of different actors happy and engaged. And you're absolutely right in that so you're familiar with the process of joining the European Union, right? The so-called acquis communautaire, right? This huge stack of legislation which you must pass, right, as a candidate member to become considered becoming a full member. But here's the thing, there's a huge difference between passing legislation and actually enacting it, right? And I can tell you, as someone who worked on NATO enlargement issues, we often had that where candidate countries would pass bits of legislation which we thought were critical, but did they actually do anything to implement it? That's a totally different topic, right? And a totally different set of metrics. So it's not a simple process, even with the best will in the world. And frankly, sometimes you weren't dealing with the best will in the world, because as you mentioned, yeah, there are people who want to derive the clear economic benefits of being in a free trade zone, which with much more developed and wealthy states, without necessarily engaging on what might be some ultimately painful reforms at home.
Like Greece, for example, how Greece got into the EU.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the idea of the current, the extending a common currency to a state like Greece, yes. The expectation is that Greece would eventually become more like Germany in terms of its fiscal policy, but that did not happen, right? I'm not blaming Greece entirely for what occurred, but one can see that the economic incentives that were created by certain decisions, they made certain actions by politicians interested in short-term gain very feasible, but imposed very long-term costs. And yes, they're still bailing themselves out of that.
Still.
Dr. Selden, I'm watching the time. Are you okay?
Yeah, for about another 5 minutes or so. That'd be great if we could wrap it up by like Yeah, 235, 240. So if there's any last question or two, I'm happy to do that.
There any other questions? Julie, I don't know if there are people in the yoke room or not.
We do have some guests here. I don't see any questions.
Okay.
I'm waiting for Rick Gold. He always has a good question for us.
Rick is being very quiet today. If there are no other questions, we're gonna let Zach get back to his classes.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your presentation today, Zach. It's always incredibly engaging and interesting, and it was today too. And thank you for making the time to speak to us.
Absolutely. No, thank you for taking the time to have me. And like I said, I always enjoy talking to this audience. It's a great perspective for me to get to kind of balance out the other end of, who I'm talking to most of the time. And, so it's helpful. So great. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you. We will mention that last week's session will be rescheduled for November 8th, and I'll send out a reminder via email for that. So we'll see you next week. Thank you,
Have a good-
everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Have a good
Selden.
afternoon. Bye-bye.